Okay, so the materials that I'm going to use today for this simple drawing exercise, I've got my drawing pad, white paper obviously. I tend to go for this slightly rough tooth paper surface for pencil drawing because the pencil tends to take to the surface a little bit better than if it's a smooth paper surface. The other thing about the paper is it's pure white. That might sound a little bit strange, but you can get paper such as cartridge paper which has a slight yellowish tint to it. I don't like that. I like the bright white paper here for the highlights, so to shine through. It doesn't have to be particularly expensive paper. In fact, photocopier paper is another material which I use for my rough drawings because that has a similar surface. Now, in terms of drawing pencils, obviously you can get different weights of drawing pencil, different hardness and softness. I'm just going to use an HB pencil for my drawing sketches today, and you can see I've sharpened it to a nice sharp point prior to starting. I'm also going to use an eraser or a rubber. I've also got this small rubber here which I can use for some of the lining details. If you haven't got one of those, you can cut a small wedge using a knife off your normal size rubber and use the edge of that. I've also got this, don't know if I have one of these, but I find this is quite good for, you put the rubber in the end of it and you can create lines using the eraser. I've also got a small piece of sandpaper which I use to sharpen my pencil. Today we're going to be drawing a bolt and lock from a garden shed. It's a black and white photograph taken by my son Andrew. I've already loaded this into my iPad. I use an app called Copy It, which you can load any photograph into, and then using the app you can actually overlay a drawing grid. You're going to use this quite simply today. You don't have to use this sort of application. You could even print out a copy of a photograph and draw this grid over the top. As you can see today, it's quite a simple grid. I'm just dividing the paper into 4 squares. This will just help us with the overall perspective of the drawing and relationships as shapes and where they appear on the picture in relation to the overall paper size. Okay, let's make a start. So using my HB pencil, what I'm going to do first is just divide the paper up into those 4 segments. So notice I'm drawing very, very lightly. Notice also how I'm holding my pencil. I tend to hold it between the 2 fingers and my thumb this way. I'm not applying hardly any pressure. I'm just letting the pencil drift over the paper and it will make a mark. Our image is slightly squarer than the rectangular shape of the paper, so I'm just drawing those lines in. And notice how faint these lines are. They're construction lines. They don't have to be perfectly straight. I'm not saying you can't use a ruler if you would feel more comfortable using a ruler. I like to just sketch in rough lines, and then later on, when they're not required, I can rub them out with my pencil. Okay, now looking at the image, I'm going to work out where the main lines are, the main sort of construction shapes. So the bolt itself appears to be in the right-hand quadrant up here. So again, I'm just drawing very, very faintly and very, very loosely at this stage, because if I make a mistake, I can quickly go back and rub it out. I'm also not particularly worried about how firm my lines are. They're very, very light at this stage. I'm just getting the overall shapes of my image into my drawing. So the bolt lock mechanism is here on the right hand side, and then we've got the line of what I think is the door itself, yep, coming down here. It's not quite vertical, but again at this stage, notice how sort of light that is on my drawing page. I'm not drawing anything particularly distinct at this stage. Now we've got the frame for the actual bolt, or the lock itself, should say, appears on this side of the, still in this quadrant. There's my center line, is still to the right of center, and then the bolt mechanism itself runs slightly lower on the bolt frame here, and then again ends about here. So you can see what I've done. Very simple at this stage. If I'm not happy with something, if I think it's wrong, at this stage it's quite easy to just rub it out and then read right back in. And it hasn't, I'm not pressing very hard on the paper, so it hasn't made an indent into the paper. And one of the mistakes that a lot of people make when they first start off drawing is they think they've got to draw quite firm lines. I would sort of thoroughly recommend doing this much more loose sketch initially to get your sort of construction lines in, rather than these firmer lines, which if you draw, of course, they're much harder to erase than these construction lines here. So what we'll be doing is we'll be adding more detail once we're happy with the overall shape. So looking at this then, the bolt mechanism comes down here. And again, using my reference drawing, I'm sort of looking up at it. The iPad's up here, so I can see what I'm doing. And if you had a printout of your picture, as large as your printer will go, ideally, place it up there, and then you can look down and compare. Okay, so just putting some of the basic shapes in again. Still, there's another line which is probably the frame of the door coming down here. Now it's not vertical. You know, again, this is where when you first start off drawing and painting, I always sort of say your brain tends to fill in some of the blanks, and your brain is probably telling you that a door is vertical, and because of that you'll draw a vertical line, and then you know, things start to look a bit odd. So I always sort of say ignore your brain, look at your image and try and replicate what you see rather than what your brain is telling you. So yeah, again, you see it. Now at this stage I'm not putting any shading in. I'm still working out the basic construction lines of my overall image. Obviously in this case it's a door with a bolt, but if it's a house or a country scene, whatever, again at this stage just get those basic sort of shapes in. Now I think there's the window here, I'm not sure, but again, ignoring what my brain is saying, just look for the shapes. There's a line coming across on my image here, which stops just before that center line construction line. There, and there's another bit over there, another couple of lines vertically, which again are sort of angled out. Obviously, the vanishing points with this image are way down off the bottom of the drawing here, and somewhere probably about 6 or 7 feet off to the right here. So there is a bit of perspective going on, but because this photograph was taken quite close up, you can't really see it. So if I wanted to, I could just draw those construction lines in. Again, just putting that in here, another line there. I'm not putting any detail in, just checking those shapes. There's what it looks like to be some sort of device down here on the door, probably for a chain or to hold the lock. So, and again, that has a small loop on it. Now again, I'm not drawing that in any detail, I'm just putting it in. I think probably that's a little bit larger. That's another thing that does tend to happen when you're drawing these sort of detail drawings of small items, you tend to make them bigger than they really are, so you can keep checking your image. But at this stage you can see I'm just making sure that everything is roughly where it should be on the drawing. I've not added any detail. The next thing I want to add is where the padlock would go on our lock. So just the rough shape of that at the moment. I'm not drawing the curves. There's a sort of panel there with two loops on it, which is where your bolt fits through, and then you put your padlock. And then there's the hook on the end of the bolt, which again fits when you put the padlock on the door. I'm just drawing that in and making sure that's in the rough location, and then I'm going to start putting in the circles. So seeing how I'm doing these, I'm not trying to draw a circle in one go. I'm sketching in the shape very roughly with lots of multiple short strokes. I'm holding my pencil. Again, quite lightly, applying very little pressure. That's the beauty of the HB pencil. It's soft enough but hard enough to make a mark. And then it's something like that. And I can refine this later if need be. Okay, so it's still quite light, and then there is another small tab at the end of the bolt bracket, and then there's a shape here. Now this part of the bolt locking mechanism is lower than this tab on this side of the frame of the door, so making sure that that's lower and that the bolt fits through there. And then we have another frame that the bolt slides through that would correspond with this arc here. I'm just making sure again that I'm getting those overall shapes in, and I'm happy with where they fit on the page. Okay, so here we have the outline. I'm quite happy with that, but if I hadn't made a mistake at this stage, as I said, I can easily rub out those light lines and reposition it. Now again, if those lines were drawn, or circles are drawn fairly firm at this stage, they're quite hard to rub out. But at this stage, I'm just making sure that everything fits on the page correctly and that everything is where it's supposed to be. It's quite a simple image I'm drawing, of course, but this same sort of rule would apply to anything. When I'd be doing a scene outside or a very detailed aviation drawing, I would start off with these very rough, loose shapes to make sure that everything is where it's supposed to be. And if I'm happy with that framework, then I can start adding in some more detail. Okay. So just checking the image again and the basic shapes, I spotted a couple of things that might need to be corrected before I proceed further. I'm not particularly happy with this area here compared with my reference photograph. I think this part of this bolt mechanism where the lock goes through, or the bolt goes through, and then you put the padlock, should be a little bit further lower down. So this is the beauty of this sort of technique. You can rub that out quite easily at this stage. And then I think this comes down here a little bit lower. So the construction line in there, which is the edge, but I think that, yeah, it's a little bit lower down. The gap between these two holes is a little bit further than I initially drew it. So something else that's a good idea is every now and again when you're drawing like this, don't go too far, take a stop, compare it back with your image and just check things are where they're supposed to be. Spend good 30-40 seconds at least just checking each area of the drawing against your reference drawing. Because the thing is that it's quite easy to carry on and then you're sketching away and this part leads to this section here, so on and so forth. And you can go, get one bit out of a line and then it tends to throw everything else off kilter, as it were. So every now and again, just check your image. The other thing I've done with these at this stage, these are perfect circles, when in reality, if I draw them in perspective over here, they're not really slightly, you're looking at them in a slight angle. So at the moment, that's fine. As construction for the layout, I'll sort that out a little bit later on and add a bit more perspective into them. But I'm just getting those basic, still getting those basic shapes in. So yeah, I think that's a little bit better. The positioning, the overall positioning, and I think this part of the bolt comes down a little bit lower as a result of that. Everything sort of fits together. Yeah, it is a simple image, a simple item to draw, but the rules apply. If something is in the wrong place, then it will immediately shout out to you, but it can also put everything else out of step, as it were. Okay, so I think that's a little bit better. I've still got my construction lines in. I can leave those in for the moment. Okay, let's start adding a little bit more detail in here. So just sharpen up my pencil. A sharper point. Blow the dust off it. And let's have a look, starting at the top. Now, this door frame is quite a bold line on the image, so I'm just reinforcing that a little bit, pressing a little bit harder than I did when I was creating the initial sketching. But because I got that guideline, and I'm happy with that guideline, it makes this stage a little bit easier. So again, looking at that, use this one here. Part of that bolt mechanism just overlaps that part of the door, a bit of a overlap on that metal plate, and actually it's not quite vertical, it's sort of slightly standing out, bending out from the door. So again, just making sure. So what I'm doing, I'm still sketching, I'm not drawing one line. I'm pressing a little bit harder, and I'm obviously taking my time, being a little bit careful. See how much that overlaps there. And it comes round parallel with this side. Not pressing too hard. Now, again, using the rubber a little bit more, just erase that bottom part, because this part of the arc on that piece of metal that holds the bolt in place on the door arcs under there. So, okay. Now, there is a screw, so I'm going to use this smaller rubber in the. It's a nice piece of kit, this. This just helps when you're rubbing out fine details. A little bit harder to use. My rubber obviously seen quite a bit of use, so the edges tend to get a bit curved off, which makes it a bit difficult. So as I said before, you can use a sharp knife to just cut the edge of your rubber and get a nice sharp point on it again. So there's a screw. So okay, so I'm starting to add a bit more detail in, but again, initially just to get that screw head in the right place, I'm doing it quite lightly. And then there's a Phillips head in it. So notice it's not quite a circle. I've drawn it that way, not that way. Okay. So the overall perspective is going this way. We're sort of looking at the door almost at a 45-degree angle. So now poking out through there is the bolt head itself. So that also has a circle on the end of it. Just filling out, no shading at this stage, just getting those much more detail in the shapes. Now again, what's quite important is making sure that bolt lines up with the main body of the bolt. You know, if we put that up there, it would obviously look odd. So I'm drawing it through as if that piece of metal is transparent to get it lined up. So again, checking my image how wide the bolt is. Okay. And then again, I can rub out this. See what I'm doing? Just rubbing that construction line out. Okay. So the back plate of the bolt is there. And then again, another piece of metal which is holding the bolt in. So it comes down. Now it would be sort of, it would conform with this shape here. So I'm just making sure, again, draw a little bit of detail in. I haven't really drawn the thickness of the metal yet. I'll come back to that. I'm just making sure that these curves sort of comply with each other, if that makes sense. So you can see I'm drawing an arc. I'm holding my pencil like this and move my wrist to get that arc effect. And I think, yeah, that's important. It's how you hold your pencil. It's quite important because you're using this side of your hand as a sort of lever to apply the pressure rather than try and draw vertically down. So I'm resting my hand on the surface and twisting it that way and that way to get the lines that I want. I mean, this all comes with practice, and yeah, I can't recommend enough that you try and draw as often as you can in your sketchbook. The more you draw, the better you get at it, really. It's like anything else. It's practice makes perfect. So again, there's a couple of screw heads in here. Draw the basic shape. This one's actually not a screw head. I think it's a bolt head. Slightly smaller, slightly below this one. So, okay, it doesn't need to be that precise. This has got a normal flat screw head in it. Comes over there. So you can see I'm starting to add some of the detail in. Now there is a plate which I missed off. So there's a plate that comes down here, bottom of that plate out there. So I think it's a bit dark on my image, so I can't actually see that edge as such. I'm just going to suggest it, and then we can come back. This is I'm going to do a line drawing initially without any shading, just so you can see the way that I construct my overall image. The base plate itself goes across here. You see how this is coming together now? I'm adding that detail in, slightly firmer lines when I'm happy with something. There's still quite a little line work going on here, and I'm leaving it because I think it adds to that sort of organic feel, if you like, of the drawing. You know, rather than try and draw it with one line down here like a technical drawing, I'm sketching. And those lines don't take away from the overall image. They add to the sense of movement as well of the image, I think. So, yep, okay, our bolt is a pretty inanimate object, but yeah, there's still a bit of movement in the actual image itself. You know, the eye is being led this way by the horizontal lines on the bolt mechanism and the vertical lines of the door. So it might not look like the image is moving much, but by putting these sort of sketchy construction lines in, we get that sense of interest in the image itself. Okay, so I'm just going to carry on and add some of this detail in here, relative amount of detail. So Again, I might need to just resharpen my pencil from time to time. You see the HP pencil, fairly soft, so it does tend to go blunt after a while. That's why I like I use a scalpel actually, and then just sharpen the pencil rather than a pencil sharpener, which points, you still get quite a lot of wood on your pencil then, and it's easier if you sort of cut your pencil that way with a fairly long, not too long, but a nice long piece of lead sticking out, and you can sharpen it that way. And then I'm just making sure. I'm going to draw these holes in here now, and as I said earlier, they're not perfect circles. They're not, we're not looking at them directly perpendicular. We're sort of looking at them from an angle of about 45 degrees. So, there's, if you like, you can sort of draw a construction box of where your circle should be, and then even a construction line inside the box. That's the centre of your circle, and then it's easier to see what I'm doing and draw your circle within that construction frame. So we're going to apply the same sort of, we're slightly looking at this hole, as it were, or the whole bolt mechanism that way. So by putting a construction line in there, I'm drawing that as a slightly off center. Now this one down here has got to be perfectly line up. So again, use a construction line and put that construction circle in. Again, multiple passes, slightly more pressure, and then when I'm happy with it, I can add some more detail. Now I think there's a bit of a, looking at my image again as a reference, the bolt mechanism, not particularly thick around the edge of that circle. Okay, so there's a slight vertical line there, so it's sort of exaggerated. It's a bit like that. Look at the image, study your image for a little while, remember a small section of it, and then replicate it on your drawing. And it's quite a tricky shape. Again, if I'm not happy with it, just use my rubber to erase it. They're still quite soft lines, easy to erase. And then this comes round here. And again, disappears into the shadow on my image, so I'll leave that missing for the moment, where this part of the bolt mechanism goes up. It probably goes up into there. Brim will start filling in bits and pieces, but actually on my image, because it's in shadow, I can't see. But the next thing, which is quite important, is where the edge of that bolt sort of loop on the end of the bolt, where you place the padlock arm, goes through. There's this sort of hook on the end here, so again there's a small circle on the end, and then it comes down here. I've already drawn some construction lines in. Again, a little bit more pressure, backwards and forwards, rather than again trying to sort of draw one firm line. I'm just gradually applying more pressure over these multiple lines once I'm happy with them. It's almost like painting with a pencil. You're sort of using small, sketchy sort of strokes. But as you stand back and look at your image, you can see the more distinct ones. So the bolt goes through here, and you can also see the top of the bolt through this loop here. So I'm just rubbing out those construction lines and just putting in that part of the bolt that's through, you can see through here. Now I've not, again at this stage, I've not added that much in the way of thickness to this metal, so it looks like it's made out of tin or thin aluminium or something, but I can do that in a little while. I'm just again, still even at this stage, making sure that everything is in the right place. There's a bit of thickness on this end tab. Okay, so, and now just around there. A bit of that thickness in. Okay, I'm fairly happy with the overall shape of the bolt. Maybe this here looks a little bit odd to the eye, so I'm just going to correct that. Again, without shading, it's a bit difficult to sort of suggest that this is actually a bent cylinder. So I'll put in a few lines there just to help with that. But later on, when we do some shading. So again, there's no shading at the moment, but let's just rub out this one. I was doing the image for you, and yep, okay. Happy with that. Bit of thickness there. So let's just add in these other main woodwork, framework, whatever they are, parts of the image. Make them a little bit firmer. Let's go down here. Again, same technique. Notice I've got my hand resting on the paper. You know, rather than trying and draw one continuous line by moving my hand across the page, it's, you know, at this sort of stage, it's easy to do short sections by resting my hand and keeping it stationary and rotating my fingers. And then as I go to the next part, and you can get quite straight lines by doing that, but you can't, you know, if you go too far, it starts arcing in. So just move your hand, join up, go to the next bit. You'd be surprised how straight, obviously with a bit of practice, you can get those lines. So that line isn't there, of course, so let me just rub that out. Okay, and then there's another part of the woodwork coming down here. Again, on my image, it's quite indistinct, so I'm just looking for the basic vertical construction lines. No detail. There's something going on here. I can see some lines. I don't know exactly what they are. I think they're probably part of the window frame, but I'm ignoring that and just looking to see. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, so there's 4 vertical lines on this, whatever it is. It's part of the window frame of the shed, I think. And then coming across here, something going on here. There's a bit of a sort of curved edge here. It's all quite loose. Notice I haven't, it probably is almost certain it's a piece of wood on the window frame, but I haven't drawn it perfectly straight. It's slightly freehand, if you like, and it just softens those lines. It's not too technical. You know, if you were drawing this as a technical drawing, there'd be perfectly straight lines, obviously. Something going on here, a bit of curved, something of a curved nature going on with this join here. Again, like all sheds, slightly weather beaten. So again, let's get those basic shapes in. Okay, quite happy with that. There's probably the door frame coming down here. And again, you know, I'm using the slight edge of the pencil here. Most of my hand actually outside the drawing here, but I'm, rather than trying to draw vertically with the point, to soften these lines up, I'm drawing slightly with the pencil, almost like flat on the surface. And it comes down through there, and then carries on down. Follow my construction lines I drew earlier, roughly. And then this, I think this is where you store the padlock when it's not in, when you've opened the shed. A metal fixture here. Okay, so this has got a curved metal section on it. So again, like a hook. Just draw it. These sort of edges, it's more difficult to draw, obviously, because it's a more complex sort of shape, relatively. So again, loosely to start with, to your happiness here. And then we know it's that sort of shape, and there is a screw head fixing it to the frame. I think probably that needs to be just a little bit longer. Because looking at my image, it actually comes a little bit further in that direction, and then we can see the screw head peering out from behind there. Okay. I'm not drawing it precisely, it's a Phillips screw head. I'm just hinting at it with a few scribbles. And again, your brain will fill in. You're suggesting it, but that's the beauty of sketching. Your brain will fill in, and someone looking at this picture will know that that is probably a Phillips screw head, and that is an ordinary screw head. It doesn't have to be precisely drawn. In fact, that looks better than that. So again, that's the beauty of sketching. Okay, so just looking at my image here, I can't really see much going on in what is in the shed. There's a few indistinct shapes. This area on my image is quite dark, so I'm just going to reinforce the edge of my image here and the overall size. And now there's a couple of things going on here, some screw holes or countersunk holes, part of the shed construction, I think. And this line here, I think, needs to be reinforced a little bit. So again, just going over it, pressing a little bit harder. And right, and then sharpen my image. Oh, sorry, my pencil. And now I can start adding in the thickness to these bolt holes, or these holes here in this metal structure. So I can just use my rubber to erase some of the construction lines. Again, same sort of technique, but obviously we're starting to add a bit more detail in now. Again, sort of still quite sketchy in my approach. It hasn't got to be perfect. No, you don't want to turn it into a technical drawing. It's still a sketch. So, there we are. There's a screw head just peering here, and another screw head with a normal screw fixture appearing there, and then using my rubber and just rub out some of these construction lines. Okay, so I'm fairly happy with it so far. There we go. It's looking fairly good. I'm quite happy with the overall composition. It's an interesting image, and I think everything is in the right place. And if I wanted to at this stage, one of the things with this is knowing when to stop. It's that applies to all art. It's very tempting to sort of carry on, but as an initial sketch, I think that's got enough detail to keep me happy without the shading being applied. Yeah. Okay, I'm happy with the overall basic image of my pencil sketch. I'm going to add some shading. So I'm going to use the HB pencil. And you could use a softer pencil, but I like using the same sort of strength of pencil, as it were, and an HB, which I find is fine for shading. Most sketching shading anyway, and constantly changing between an HB and a 6B or whatever, it can get quite annoying. So just having one pencil weight is fine. The other tool I'm going to use, very sophisticated piece of equipment, is a cotton bud. And I use these to help me with blending. You'll see in a moment how that works. So just a common garden cotton bud works quite well. Of course, you can use your fingers. You tend to get graphite all over yourself. So do watch for that. Get it on your clothes. So I'm going to add a bit of shading in now. So again, using my HB pencil, I'm going to just look for the dark areas. Now, what I'm doing is I'm shading much the same way as I sketch. So I'm looking for the dark areas in my image to start with. So just again, resting my hand on my image here, on my painting or drawing rather, and then not applying too much pressure, but what you'll notice is I'm applying the shading as like a crosshatch, and it's heading southwest, as it were, in the sort of diagonal across the paper. And initially, I like to keep all my shading going in that same direction. You'll see what I mean in a moment. It just helps bring the image together. So there's a quite dark vertical line, which I guess is the door opening. I'm not applying too much pressure, a little bit more pressure than I was doing earlier with my construction and more detailed lines. And it doesn't, as long as it fits between the lines, that's fine. I don't worry if it goes over a little bit at this stage. Now over here, there's a dark area as well. So I'm looking at my image and sort of partly squinting and sort of trying to work out where the dark and light areas of my image. So this line, which is door opening, is very dark. Over here is very dark, but I'll come back to it in a moment. And this area here, these 1, 2, 3 sections are also quite dark. So again, notice how I'm holding my pencil slightly further down the pencil. Again, placing my hand on the paper here, and it's quite a gap between where I'm holding and the tip of the pencil where I'm applying it. So I'm applying it at quite an angle to the paper. So I'm using the flat part of my pencil, and I'm going over all 3. And I'm not worried, all 3 sections. I'm not worried if I go over the line too much. I'm not applying too much pressure at this stage. Just putting those basic sort of shading in. It's not as dark as this area here. This is probably the darkest, one of the darkest lines on my image. Now, behind the bolt here, it gets very dark. But this is the next tonal value on my image. This area here, there's a dark line going across here underneath this piece of wood. So again, I'm applying that in the direction that the wood goes. So I'm sort of dragging my pencil. I'm not resting my hand this time. I'm actually slightly above my work surface, and sort of using it in the same direction as the wood goes itself. So, yep. And I've just noticed that I made a bit of a mistake with the image here. So this area here doesn't actually go the way that I've drawn it. So now I'm starting to shade. I've noticed I spotted that. So that there, this comes down and then goes up here. So there's a little bit of a rebate here. I'd drawn it there when actually, and this is the thing, you have to constantly keep checking your image. Now I'm applying the shading, and they're exactly the same if this was a painting and I was applying the paint. I've noticed a mistake. So, this is the thing, keep checking your image. That goes a bit more. That line there doesn't exist. So I'm using my rubber to erase it. Okay, so now that I'm applying the shading shapes, I've spotted that. This area here to the left of the bolt is also quite dark, so I'm applying a bit more pressure. With the same rule, I'm sort of dragging the pencil, I'm putting the shading in, following like a crosshatch in the same sort of direction at this stage. A bit more pressure because it's quite dark. This whole area down here is in shade, so it's quite dark. Okay. So, a bit more pressure again, a bit more precise in this area. But the bolt itself is quite light. So, and the actual plate is also quite light. But it's quite dull down here, so again I'm shading underneath the bolt. But again, notice that I'm sort of cross-hatching and applying that shading in the same direction. It just helps bring the image together. If you have your shading going in all sorts of different directions, it can make the image a little bit difficult to read, and you spend a lot more time shading and trying to get that shading all to come together. Okay, I'll come on to this dark area in a moment, but we'll do that last because I'm just making sure that's fairly dark, but you can see some wood grain on it, so I'm just dragging the pencil lightly over the surface to suggest that wood grain, and then that edge there is slightly more pronounced than I've drawn it, and this section of those 3 vertical lines again is slightly darker than these 2 here, so I'm just going over that again. Doesn't have to be precise, it's just suggesting it. You see the image is starting to come together in a 3D form now that we've applied the shading. So the rules are really sketch first, add some more precise construction lines, then shade. Okay, so there's a bit going on here. So I'll probably speed up the image at this stage while you watch me do this. So I'll come back to you when I've done a bit more shading. Now, there are still some darker areas underneath this bolt here, so I'm just going to bit of wood grain here, suggesting the wood grain really. And the wood grain here, an interesting little bit of a nail has gone through the wood and put a little notch in there. It's quite an interesting little shape, and this area is quite dark. So pressing much harder now with my shading to get that nice and dark. But again, still cross-hatching and just defining the edge a little bit better on this very dark line, and still using my HB. It's tempting to maybe use a softer pencil for this, but I find you can still use the HB and get those different tonal values. Okay, so this area here on the image is quite dark in shade, so I'm just covering that whole area. And under here is also, under the bolt, is quite dark. And there's like a dark shadow, probably of this mechanism here. So again, just shading that in. Now this is where I can start to use my my cotton bud to blend. See how effective that is of just softening up those lines. Much more effective than your finger, again over the dark areas. In the same direction. Just blends in and adds a bit more softening of the tonal values. A bit like using charcoal really, with something to smudge, you might say, some of the lines in there. And I'm just heading in the direction of the object that I'm drawing or sketching. So there's a bit of a darker area here. So while I'm in blending, obviously quite a lot of graphite ended up on the end of my cotton bud, so I can sort of use that to help soften down some of these areas. Okay, see how that's coming together now. Okay, and nice and loose. Okay, darker underneath the bolt, obviously. Now, this surface of the bolt mechanism in this area here is quite dark, so just sharpen up my pencil a little bit, and then I'm going to a little bit more carefully cross-hatch that area. I'm not applying too much pressure, just cross-hatching. See how that works. And as I come down here, it gets very dark, so a bit more pressure. And under there is very dark, so I'm applying a bit more pressure. My lines will, or my shading will become darker. So I'm still looking really for the overall tones. And I'm not worried if the shaded areas at the moment look a bit imprecise. I'm just making sure I'm getting the total values, as we would call it, right and correct. So this area here is quite dark. So that's coming in. There's a dark area in here. That is slightly darker. The part of the bolt is darker here. And then use my finger to smudge that in a bit. Okay, so this edge of this curved hook on the end of the bolt is also a little bit darker on that edge, and also on this edge here, and it's very dark under there. Okay, darker under there, bring in shade, and this end stop, I think it is for the bolt, is also quite dark, and a little bit darker down this edge behind this door frame. But with this I'm adding in the grain and adding my shading this time more in the direction that the grain heads, and then that edge there behind the bolt is also quite dark. Okay, so let's, looking at that, I'm quite happy with it so far. a bit of dark area under that screw, and this edge here, I think it's a bolt head. It's not a screw head, it's a bolt head there holding it in. Okay, and then in here, it's quite dark. Shadow under the bolt, and then a bit more detail in now in the shading. Again, observing, looking at my image, and then replicating what I see from my image onto my drawing in terms of tonal values and shading. Okay, that's starting to come together. Right, for this area here, which is really dark, I'm going to use the same technique, but I'm sort of placing my... No, I'm not worried about... I mean, you may say my image is starting to smudge a little bit and get a bit indistinct as I move over it. I'm also getting quite a lot of graphite onto my hand, so do be careful. You know, that stuff, you get it on a white shirt, or it's a little bit difficult to get off. But so I'm beginning to smudge the image, but I'm not worried about that in a minute. I'll come back. In fact, that's working for me. So this whole area here is quite dark, so I'm starting at the top and I'm applying quite a bit of pressure. Now it won't be totally black. Obviously I could use a softer pencil, but you know, this is an HB pencil drawing demonstration, and just going to use that one pencil weight. But again, notice much larger strokes, but notice that I'm still going in the same direction as all my other shading. And by doing that, it sort of brings everything together, but it also, I assume this is a pane of glass, so there's no real surface on it. We can see through into the shed and maybe see a few things, or maybe a few reflections from outside. But it is quite dark. There's no surface. It's a shiny surface, obviously. So that will fool the brain into thinking that's a... in technical drawing, we used to illustrate panes of glass on a technical drawing that way. So it's same sort of technique, really. I'm just trying some hatching over that dark area, and I can continue to add layers up to a point. I mean, HB will never be totally black, but it's a dark area. Now, dark here, and there are some wood grain. So again, holding my pencil fairly lightly and just dragging the pencil backwards and forwards in the direction that the wood grain travels. A bit of a knot there. And that colours, you know, so this one, the wood grain's going vertical. This one, obviously, the wood grain's going horizontal. So just redefine that. I'm pressing quite hard now. The other thing, really, which I'd recommend, I didn't mention at the beginning, but I'm drawing in my pad, so I've got 2 or 3 sheets obviously in my drawing pad, and that softens up the surface underneath, and that helps when you're doing the shading. So I'm obviously using a drawing pad, but if you're using a sheet of paper, say a bit of photocopier paper, it's going to draw on something soft. This is a glass worktop and it's pretty hard, so I was drawing straight through one sheet of paper onto that harder surface, then my lines would actually end up being a little bit harder. But when you're, especially when you're doing softer in distinct areas, and the way that I draw, start to have a slightly cushioned surface underneath of the other sheets of paper to help sort of soften the weight of the pencil. So that's another tip, really. Don't draw on a single sheet of paper on a hard surface. Have a couple of sheets of paper underneath it. Okay, if you draw too hard, you will make an indent onto the next sheet of paper, but you've got to really press to do that. With an HB pencil, there's not really too much of a risk of doing that. Okay, all right, so looking at my image now, I'm fairly happy with the overall shading. So now I'm going to add some highlights. So using either I could use this small rubber, or as I said earlier, cut a small piece of rubber off your main rubber, and start to add some highlights. I like using this little pin for the rubber, and then I'm rubbing out where the highlights are. Okay, so there's a highlight along this edge, another highlight going through here. You can hardly really see it, it's just subtle hints of where the light is catching the bolt and the mechanism and this framework. There's a bit of a highlight there, another highlight. See how that now is beginning to look curved? There's another highlight where it's catching the bolt here. There's a highlight along that edge. Slight highlight down this edge here, very slight. Just looking for the highlights again, a highlight on this part of the bolt mechanism. There's a highlight which has got lost now in my shading, so you can see I'll put that back in. And across here. There's some highlight areas here as well in this wood, so I'm just adding those in, and a highlight on this part of the bolt. Okay, so just removing some of the pencil. Make sure I'm catching the highlights. Okay, quite pleased with that so far. Let's now, final stage really, just to add some more sharp lines in to bring out some of that detail, and then I think we're done. So this screw head, I've sharpened my pencil, and I'm just, this time I am applying almost a single line, just sharpening up some of the detail points to bring them out. And the underside of that bolt down this edge is quite dark, so just very small cross hatching, a little bit dark in that area there, pressing fairly hard, and it's starting to bring out the detail. So there's the bolt going through. Can't really see what's going on in this area here, so I'm just gonna, so much in shade, I'm just gonna replicate that rather than try and fill it in with my brain and say, well, I know there's a line there, I can't see it on my image, so I'm gonna leave it out. It's shading. So there's a bit of a dark area on that, not too much detail. It's finding that right level of detail while still being sketchy. Now the underside of this hook is also quite dark, so you can see I'm pressing fairly hard at this stage. And then it comes round there, and then this edge of the bolt here, again, is quite hard. And then there's a firm shadow under here, which will help bring out this surface of the, by putting a sort of darker line around the light areas, it just exaggerates it. But again, shading, even though it's dark, I'm still going in the same direction. So, and then there's a sharp line along here, and another sharp line at the other edge of that bolt. So I'm sort of concentrating on the bolt frame. This is the main focus of this drawing, so I'm not too worried about these other areas at the moment. I'm just making sure that I'm getting this bolt area and the fitment right. So a bit of the shadow of another screw head there, and another screw head there, a couple of lines to suggest, and it's darker on this lower edge. And coming around that, this line here is very sharp, so just sharpen up my pencil again, blow the dust off it, and then this comes around here, and I'm going to concentrate on this little area, and that comes round here, but I can still see my construction lines that I drew in the first stage. It's much easier at this stage. I mean, how much detail you put in is entirely up to you. I mean, it depends what your subject is, but this is sort of illustration of the way that I do it. I'm now starting to add some detail, and then if I make a mistake, I can still rub it out and bring those highlights back. And the highlight on that eyelet comes around here, and this is quite dark. So again, by using that shading effect, cross-hatching, and that is a little bit darker, and there is a line going. So it's starting to come together as an image. As a drawing, I quite like it. Yeah, don't go over the top with the detail, I would suggest. You know, I'm starting to go that way now. Yeah, because once you start with this sort of detail, it's quite difficult to stop. And yeah, you get carried away. I'm not going to draw every single wood grain streak as I see it. It's just suggested. So you know, it's a drawing of this bolt mechanism, so that's the area where I'm focusing. And that's dark. This is quite dark in here. I probably made this area a little bit thinner than it really is in real life. I could still correct that. So edge is quite dark. There's a nice contrast between this light area and this dark area here, which makes the image a little bit interesting. And then that comes around and goes under there. Okay, another bolt, screw head rather, just about see it there on the image. And this area is quite dark. And then behind the bolt is also quite dark. Lightly shading that area in, so it just accentuates the highlight along the top edge of that mechanism. And then there's a line there. There's something going on here, I don't know what, but then we've got this curved rebate I was talking about earlier. This area here is quite dark. This area here is quite dark. And there's a few things going on in here. I'm just going to suggest them. I don't know what is in the shade, I can't really see. And I think this is where the edge of the glass is slightly over painted, but there's some interesting shapes, slightly indistinct in there, but it gives the impression there's something, maybe a bit of paint peeling off or something here. So I can see, add a bit of interest into that area. Something, yeah, a few little bits of peeling paint possibly on that edge. Don't want to overdo it because I don't want to take away the interest in this area here. And then that is now quite dark. So I'm again going over this area, and again towards the edge of the picture you can make it darker. Okay, and this edge is also quite dark. So let's have a look at the image so far and see how it compares with my photograph. I mean, obviously you know, these areas are really dark on the photograph, and there's a lot more contrast between the lights and the darks in the black and white photograph. You wouldn't be able to achieve that with an HB pencil. But we're not far off, but I'm again just looking at the overall tones. I think this whole area is slightly darker than I've drawn it, but the interest is in the bolt area here. So I think I've got that fairly well drawn out. I'm quite happy with that. So I'll just add a little bit more definition, and I think maybe just making these areas a little bit darker, not too dark, but to sort of accentuate the bolt area. And bring out this secondary hook or whatever it is down here. Just, okay, so there's a bit of an edge still. Losing that edge a little bit. That edge is still there. Wood grain goes vertically. And this is actually the edge of the image. So I'm going to, again, by sort of drawing at the edge of the image and shading it, fool the eye into thinking the rest of the image is actually quite dark as well. You'll see what I mean in a moment when I add a bit more definition. So I'm beginning to bring this section out now in tonal values. And then there's one more attempt at making that a bit darker. Okay, and then down here, and to bring this hook out, quite dark. Dark underneath, bit of shading underneath it. Use my cotton bud. There you can see, I'm using the cotton bud by sort of holding it on the paper and squeezing it onto the paper and just creating that. Okay, and then this edge is quite sharp, and then again just sharpen my pencil. You can see I've used up quite a bit of the lead, but I haven't actually resharpened the pencil itself, just the lead, so that's why we use a nice long sharpened pencil before we start our drawing. Have that nice long lead, and then I'm going to keep going back to our scalpel or knife. Yeah, this area in here is a little bit darker. Okay, so and then very dark in there. It's not the main part of our drawing, the secondary hook, and I don't want it to distract too much from the overall composition, but it is there, so I'm drawing it in. I think I've actually put it slightly more to the left than it is in real life. There's a bit of a hole there. But again, I can use my rubber to just highlight the top of it and just sharpen that up a little bit. Dark along that. Just suggesting it's there really, because this is the main subject. There's a bit of a shadow under there. Okay, do you know, I'm fairly happy with that. I think maybe just this little looking at the, again, take a bit of time to look at the image and sort of cross-check it. You know, it's sort of, that's still a little bit flat. But don't overdo it, you know. I'm quite happy with that. So just using the rubber, I'm going to redefine the edge of my image. Comes down here. And along the bottom here. And okay, this is some of my demo drawing, but again, just sharpen the edge of the image a bit there and across the top. And yeah. Okay, there we go. A garden shed bolt mechanism in HB pencil. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope it's informative, and yeah, just carry on and do your own drawing. It's all about practice, really. Okay, hope you enjoyed that. Take care, and I'll do some more of these in the future. Bye now.